What's up, everybody? My name is Joe Brown. This is the Heresy Financial Show, and today I've got a fantastic guest on the show for you today, Per Bylund. He is one of my favorite modern-day Austrian economists. He is the assistant professor of entrepreneurship and Records Johnston Professor of Free Enterprise in the School of Entrepreneurship at Oklahoma State University. On top of that, he is the author of fantastic books like this one, The Seen, The Unseen, and The Unrealized. Link below. Per, thank you so much for joining us today. Well, Per, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about this conversation.
Hey, thanks for having me. This will be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, here's what I would like to do. Number one, I've talked about the topics and the themes in your book, The Seen, The Unseen, and The Unrealized. I've got that linked in the description below in tons of my videos on this channel. So I'm really excited to kind of get a breakdown and go through these pieces systematically. So if it's all right with you, I'd like to give a very high level overview, just a crude, almost caricature of what we're going to talk about. You can correct me anything that I misspoke on, and then we'll go through it piece by piece. Does that sound all right?
That sounds great. Let's do it.
So in my understanding of this, we start off with the scene, and that's the classic example of this is the broken window. Some kid breaks my window. I have to go replace my window. Then the window seller gets a nice little extra payday. Everybody looks at that and says, that's what we can see. So it's good because that's economic activity. And then you take it one step further. Well, first of all, that's modern economics. That's where the Keynesians like to stop, and that's what everybody can, because it's easy. Take one step further, though, and you get to the unseen, which is I was going to go buy a new pair of shoes, but now I can't do that. And so net society is down one window. There's less wealth than there was before because the window was broken and had to be replaced. I couldn't spend the money on the shoes, and then all the downstream effects from there. That's typically understood by most people as well if they do any critical thought. The next piece, though, we move into a couple things: value, regulation, and unrealized, which is the big piece here that we'll get to at the end. Value, it's ordinal, it's subjective, and people left to their free choices will pursue actions that maximize their value based on their own subjective wants and needs. And regulation comes in, which is the express purpose of regulation is to change behavior. You don't have to have a law that says people need to sleep at night, because for the most part, people sleep during the night, right? So laws change behaviors. And so when you have something come in and artificially change behaviors, now you have that value ranking is no longer able to be sought after. Maybe the first thing or the second thing, you can't pursue that anymore. So regulations come in and by definition, change behavior into something that is less valuable than what would have happened naturally. But the real key here we'll get into is the unrealized, which is the downstream effects of all that, because wealth is evolutionary and cumulative and builds on itself. And that's the real piece here. So did I give an all right caricature of this?
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I think that summarizes it really well.
Okay, well, perfect. Let's break this down then, go through it piece by piece. Let's talk about this scene more in detail, because it's such it seems so obvious to many that it's a fallacy, the broken window fallacy. What is it about it that keeps on attracting monetary policy and fiscal policy and modern economists to try and pursue actions that kind of look like they fit into this broken window fallacy?
Well, I think, at the very core is simply that it's data. So we can measure it, we can see it, and since we can observe it, that's what's going on. And of course, we can't know really what would have happened if this was not the real world, right? So anything else would sort of be a, not hypothesis, but maybe even a fantasy or imagined, so it's not really real. And we see this a lot with people comparing. Say, the minimum wage is a standard example, right? That where they raise the minimum wage and they see people are not unemployed to a greater extent than before, so obviously it worked, and now the average wage is much higher than it used to be, so economic theory is wrong. And how do you argue against that? Well, you would have to start by simply saying, well, you can't really compare before and after, because you should compare after the policy with what after would have been like without the policy, right? Because there are so many things that are changing in the economy.
Right.
And that really makes it really complex, and it seems that it's really unreliable as well, right? I mean, you're practically guessing what the world would be like. So economists who are empirical economists, they try to solve this problem by producing a counterfactual. So they might look at two different states, for instance, one that imposes a minimum wage and one that does not, but is similar. Or they might construct a combination of other states with certain weights that sort of fits with the state that imposed this minimum wage, but they don't have the minimum wage. And then you can sort of make up this example that seems to fit the historical data, and then you just assume that this would continue into the future. But it's still based on a lot of assumptions, right? So it's still data, which we are taught in school and on TV and everywhere, that data are hard. It's the natural sciences, right? It's physics. You can travel to the moon, that sort of thing. In the social sciences, no one is going to use social sciences to travel to the moon. It's not going to happen, right? So it's fuzzy. It's a little soft. It's not the hard sciences. Mm-hmm. Whereas I would argue that it's actually the other way around. Right? I would say that there are the social sciences and there are the simple sciences. The social sciences are much more complex, but that also has a method that is much more reliable. But I mean, we might get to that later.
So you talk about this in your book a little bit in terms of ineffective versus effective regulation, because if they come out and they say, hey, the minimum wage is going to go from $7 to $8 an hour, but 99% of people are already making over $10 an hour, that's an ineffective regulation because it doesn't change any behavior, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we can regulate anything we want and put it at such a level that it's not going to affect anything. Well, then regulations have no effect. But the whole point of regulations is to cause some change in behavior or get rid of some phenomenon or something like that, right? So we tax alcohol and tobacco really highly because then people will use less of it because we think it's unhealthy and politicians don't want us to drink and smoke, right? But sure, they could impose a tax of zero and say, yay, it's zero tax on, but we're still imposing it. Well, it's not going to change anybody's behavior. People are going to drink and smoke just as much. And the same thing with, I mean, prohibiting anything or adding a cost to something or saying that, just like you said with the minimum wage, that, oh, everybody needs to pay at least $2 an hour. Well, no one pays less than that, so it doesn't affect anything at all. What you're trying to do is to change how the world looks and what the world is like, what it looks like, right? So you would need to say that, well, let's impose a minimum wage at a level higher than people actually have, so that we don't have any low-paying jobs anymore. That's the whole point, right? And then we can argue, okay, what are the real effects of this? Because what the minimum wage does is not provide extra salary to people. It doesn't pay people extra. The only thing it says is that you cannot hire anyone unless you pay them this much, right? It's a prohibition. So you can set it at 15, as people are claiming they should have now, right? But if you want people to get rich and if this actually works, why not set the minimum wage at $50 or $5,000 an hour? Then they would make a lot of money, right? If it just means that wages go up, then go ahead. So the real analysis of it is, what are the actual effects of this? If we impose this thing and it's effective, then it has some effect. What effect is it? And that's what economists need to answer and do it well, right? Do it in the right way.
Right. Yeah, because the seen effects of, let's say, this minimum wage example, they're very relatively easy to collect this data on, because you've got all the employment data, you've got the wages, and so you can look and you can say all these people were making $7 an hour, now they're making $10 or $15 an hour, whatever it is. It's a lot harder to look at that and say, of all of these people that got that raise, they're working this many hours less than compared to before. It's harder to say there are fewer hiring decisions made because that's one of those things that's not seen. And there is no data because it's by definition a lack of data of something like, hey, they didn't hire this person because whereas they would have before potentially.
Right, and that's the problem that we're struggling with in entrepreneurship too. We can't really study failures because they're not there anymore. Right, we can only study successes, and it's the same thing with minimum wages. If we say, well, imagine we impose a minimum wage of $50, and then after we impose this minimum wage, we go out and we look at the statistics and we collect all this data and we look at, okay, so how much are people actually making? We're not going to find anyone who makes less than $50 because we just imposed that rule, right? But what else happens and what did not happen, especially that did not happen, right? That's what is important. How many startups are we not seeing because there's no way in hell that they can pay $50 an hour while they're trying to figure out their value proposition, right? There's simply no way. And usually they have interns, and I mean the entrepreneur, him or herself, is working for free. Maybe the whole entrepreneurial team is working for free because they can't afford paying wages at all. And then they have to make a hire because they need someone to do something specific that they can't do, or they need more people to work simply. Well, at $50 an hour, they probably can't do that. So the startup either doesn't grow or doesn't take off, or maybe they don't even start it because it's no point, right? How do you capture that, the startup that never happened? It's not in the data, obviously, right? Because the data can't study or observe anything. It can't record anything that didn't happen.
What are some things that you look around today and say, hey, here are some really good examples of things that that have big seen results, but are potentially causing large unseen bad negative consequences?
Well, a lot of these things, right? And the problem is that there are so many regulations that when you start looking at this, you go, "Oh my goodness, what what is going on in this world?" Because most of what we're seeing is totally inefficient and just madness. We see a lot of these phenomena that, and I mean, types of businesses, industries that take off and become really big, and you start asking why, and they look, well, wait a minute, because of all these regulations, we probably wouldn't have seen this because consumers are not actually all that interested in this, right? But they would have chosen something else if something else had been there, right? And I mean, there are plenty of these examples of regulations, just regulations that are really burdensome and costly and that change things. I mean, you have like the Jones Act here in the U.S., where in order to transport something from one port to the other, if the ports are in the U.S., both of them, you have to use a ship that's flagged in the U.S., that is built in the U.S., I think, and has a U.S. crew. Which means if you're transporting something from California to Hawaii, very often it's cheaper to go to Japan and then back to Hawaii. Because then you can use a ship that is owned by someone somewhere else, and you have a foreign crew and whatnot else, right? So very often, then you're seeing these. If you're looking at the trade routes today, you'll see that why are they doing all this crazy stuff? I mean, why are they from California transporting just a lot of stuff that goes to Hawaii, but some of it is going to Japan. So they're going to Japan first and then back to Hawaii. Why not stop in Hawaii and then go to Japan? Well, the reason is because you need to stop at an international harbor first in order to go to Hawaii, because otherwise you're violating the Jones Act. And there are many of these things when you just start looking at what is actually going on, you go, why in the world? Because it doesn't make any sense, right? It doesn't make no sense whatsoever to ship things to Hawaii via Japan. But that still happens.
Right. Another example of this I saw recently is Vans shoes. They put felt on, I think, 60% of the bottom of the sole because then legally it's classified as a slipper, not a shoe. And there's much lower tariff on importing slippers versus shoes. And so you have this, massive somebody in the felt industry did a good job lobbying to get this specific rule passed there, because now there's a big misallocation of resources at the very least to put money into felt bottom shoes, whereas that would not happen otherwise.
Yeah, and we see these examples everywhere, right? So you see in around the Mediterranean, you're going to see a lot of houses that are not fully built. So it looks like they just stopped and the top story is never completed. So you just have these pieces of metal sticking out of the what should be the ceiling or the roof and stuff like that. And why is that? Because they need to pay taxes at completion. So if they never complete the house, then they don't have to pay that tax, right? And the same thing you saw earlier anyway in Sweden, where your tax rate for a property would go up if you had bathrooms that were fully tiled, which meant the tile went from floor to ceiling, which meant everybody stopped a number of inches from the ceiling, so they didn't put tiles all the way up, right? And if you see it and you're used to it, you don't ask the question. But if you see it as a foreigner, for instance, going to Sweden, like, why didn't you put the tile all the way up? I mean, is there some weird design? Everybody has this. Why is that the case? Well, it's because of tax reasons. We would like to have tile all the way, but we're not putting tile all the way because it's so darn costly because of the tax rules. So everybody's always just trying to avoid this extra cost, because at some point it gets too costly. It's simply not worth it. Right, and then you change your behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. If you like that, there is more where that came from. Go ahead and click on this thumbnail to watch the entire unedited interview. As always, thanks so much.